Chapter 6. Trailing and Catching Thieves. Early the next morning I struck the trail. About 12 noon I rode up to a ranch house, but no one was home. I looked around and saw a saddle and blanket where it had been taken off, the horse some time before. There had been so many cattle coming to the water around the place, I couldn't find horse tracks leaving the ranch. The tracks of my shod horses had been trampled out a mile or so back on the trail of the ranch, but were headed that way when last seen. I was circling the ranch trying to find my horse's tracks when I saw a man on a little hill off a mile or less away. I headed for him. He was George Kelly, the owner of the ranch. He was looking for his horses, too. Every horse he had disappeared during the night. I found the gate to the pasture open, so he thought the stock had rubbed it open. When I told him about my own horses, he knew they had been taken by thieves who took mine. He was fit to be tied about losing them. He told me to go to the Horn Ranch and get Marshal Fatty White and a horse for him. Get a pack horse, too, he added. We will try to follow them to hell and get those horses back. He swore vilely. I did not want to take the time to go to the Horn Ranch, for that meant 24 hours of hard riding, and it would give the thief that much more time to get away. But Mr. Kelly was afoot and a long way from any other ranch. I could expect help from him. He was an old-timer, and he knew the country. He could be of great help to me and save us time. I suggested that he had better take my horse and go to the Horn Ranch himself. I suggested that I cook up a lot of hardtack and have some meat roasted by the time he got back. I told him to take old Dynamite and light out, and I would walk back to the house. I set out on foot, taking my slicker, carbine, and what provisions I had. He had hardly started when Dynamite threw a fit about his new rider. I heard an awful racket and looked over at Kelly and saw him standing on his head in the air, Dynamite with his back lowered, and pitching so high and fast that my saddle stirrups were clanking together over his back every time he hit the ground. I ran to the horse, but before I could get to him, he had thrown his head up and the tail over his back. He started home at a lively speed. I knew the jig was up. I would have to hoof it to the ranch to get a horse. I turned to see if Mr. Kelly was broken in his long, screaming neck, or maybe worse. I could see him lying full length upon the ground. I had left my canteen of water in the saddle for him. I saw it lying a few yards from him. I picked it up and headed for him. A sudden stop of his bald head had rendered him unconscious. It took me some time to get his pulse breathing and his breath back. I took him by the arm and got him to his feet. He could not stand. His head seemed to be too heavy for his body, and he pitched forward upon his face and skinned it some. I saw I had a helpless man in my hands again. I surely did wish I hadn't trusted him to ride that devil of a horse. He had acted fine with me, but I had always watched him and never let him take advantage for one moment, not even in the harness. I had not warned Kelly, and that was why he was thrown so fast. I got some sticks to build a shade over Mr. Kelly, and just as I started back, I happened to notice a shod horse track that I recognized as that of my own dun horse. I had found the trail. I could tell there had been 15 or 20 barefoot horses driven in the bunch with my horses. I went to Kelly and made shade using my slicker for a top, and then wet my handkerchief and laid it on his head. When I got to my feet, I saw a Mexican on a burro. He was driving two more with water kegs on them. He was headed for the ranch. I started for him in a trot and headed him off. I was hot, out of breath, and short on patience. I'd yelled and waved my hat at him, but he paid me no attention. He just kept going. Using a little sign language, some English and a dash of Spanish, I told him what I wanted. He shook his head and said, "Menos sabe." I pointed to Kelly and said, "Vamos, hombre mucho malo," which meant for him to go to the man who was sick. He told me he had to go to the windmill and get water for a sheep camp. I told him he would get Kelly to the house or he would go to hell, pronto. I didn't have any trouble telling him to drive his burros to the ranch, and I used no soft words. He grinned at me and made me furious. I drew my gun as quick as lightning and knocked him off his burro. I hit him hard, and if his skull hadn't been so thick and hard, he would have had a dead Mexican on my hands. We had no further trouble. He helped me put Kelly on the burro, and he got up behind him and took him to the ranch. I drove the pack of burro afoot. I found writing paper and told him to fill his kegs while I wrote a letter. I addressed a letter to the foreman of the Horseshoe Ranch and told him what had happened. I asked what they'd get Fatty White word. I went out to give the letter to the Mexican. I saw a man coming, and he was leading old Dynamite in a gallop. He was a mean, but surely did look good to me right then. The man was Jim Curtis, one of the owners of the DZ and Horseshoe Ranch. While following their trail in the direction of Kelly's ranch, Jim had seen my horse galloping across the prairie with a saddle on. He went into the house and looked at Kelly. He wanted to know if I wanted him to get white. I told him I thought I could handle the thieves, providing I could get within gunshot of them. He gave me fair warning. If this is Tom Boulders and his gang, you'll probably get yourself killed. He is a bad character and the best rifle shot in New Mexico. We hired the Mexican to look after Kelly and took to the trail. We camped that night in the desert with nothing for our horses to eat but sagebrush, and not much of that. Next morning we headed due west as the sand had covered up the signs of the horse tracks. We had no particular trail to follow. We pushed on as fast as we could go. We crossed the desert that day and found water and not much grass. The next day, about 9, we found the trail of our horses where they had been watered. We decided that we were at least 4 men and close to 100 horses. My horse tracks were plain, showing that they were both being ridden behind the herd. This made me furious to think that they were riding them to death. We met 2 men that morning about 11 who had seen the Mexican thieves. They told us they were about 10 miles ahead. We asked the men to help us, but they refused. I felt the 2 men were either on the dodge or up to some mischief themselves. Mr. Curtis mentioned that the big fellow looked like Henry Hawkins, a horse stealer himself. We tied our horses and rested, then pushed on. That evening we spotted 2 men lounging on some grass about 100 yards from us. We tied our horses and crept closer. I wanted to hail the 2 men, but Curtis said no. He wanted to wait until they had gone to sleep and then plug them. He said our chances would be better that way, so we waited for the moon to rise. I pondered shooting the men while they slept. Just as we got in position to strike, I whispered to Curtis, "Jim, I can't shoot those men in their sleep. That's murder." He looked angry as he said, "You fool, don't wake up Boulder. He wouldn't give you a chance." But I insisted. I told him to let me go to the other end of the canyon and for him to stay put. I said, "When you hear my gun, you do your work here. You can plug both these devils before they wake up, and with one of us at each end of the horses, we can get them all." "Okay, but don't blame me if you end up a carcass," he whispered. I crept away and kept in the shadows of the timber along the side of the canyon until I passed all the horses. I went half a mile or more up on the canyon. I found 3 horses staked, and I knew there were 3 men at the end. I nosed around until I located them in a bunch of timber. I untied all the horses and started back to creep up near the 3 men, when I struck my leg against a bush and it snapped. I saw that I had awakened one of the men. I raised my gun, but it was too slow that time. Boulder was the quickest man I ever saw, or else he had been awakened by the horses that had trotted down the canyon and been watching me. We exchanged shots, then all was quiet. I lay flat on the ground, and 2 men lay in front of me. I saw one man crawl away with a bullet in his arm. I had fired 8 shots. My carbine was empty. I lay there for several minutes, waiting for noise. I spoke, but no answer. I felt some relief. I got up to go back down the canyon. I felt weak for some reason. I realized blood was running down the front of my shirt. It flowed profusely to the center of my chest on my right side. I made my way down to Curtis, and when I saw him, he said, "I suppose they got away? I expected it. You had just to be noble, didn't you?" I left 2 up on the ground and 1 with a bullet in him. "What did you do here?" "Got 1. "Why not both?" I asked. "I did get 1. When the shooting started up there, they both jumped and made a run for the horses, nearly running me over. I tried to shoot, but the damn thing wouldn't shoot. I dropped my rifle and pulled my pistol, and I got 1, and the other got away." Jim was breathless as he told his side of the story. "Well, you did worse than I did." He examined my wound and said, "You nearly dead, kid." "Thanks. I needed those kind words about now. You sure do bury a fellow before he stops breathing." I liked Jim, and couldn't help but being amused at him. He got me some water and made a bed out of my blanket and slicker. I settled on the ground, and then he asked, "Well, you plan to just lay there and die?" I think he was serious. "No, but I did think I needed a little rest. I don't usually bleed this much when I'm shot." He started to reply, but just clamped his mouth shut and shook his head. He insisted on going to a doctor, but I was too weak to argue. We needed to help with the dead men anyway. I asked him to break a cedar brush and make a shade over the men, but he refused. In fact, he laughed at me. He said if I hadn't been hurt, he would have just thrown them into the bushes and go back home. He saddled up one of the horses the men had stolen from his place and warned me not to move, and he would be back as soon as possible. Left alone with 3 dead men, and maybe more, I could feel death closing in. My short life seemed to pass before me as I lay back and tried to rest. I thought of the good advice various friends had tried to give me. I thought of the fate of Joe Beckham, and Buck, and Dave, and all of the many times Buck had told me how his brother had been framed for political reasons. I lay perfectly still as I could feel blood oozing from my body. I was just a lone cowboy. Right then it looked as if I would die on the open range I'd loved so well. I slept. I woke up. I slept again. I slept fitfully. Then it was morning. I was too weak to raise my head from my saddle. Finally I managed to get a drink from my canteen. I listened to the murmur of the wind and the trees and wondered if God was calling me home. I closed my eyes and pondered the lonely life of a cowboy. All work, not much time for play, cold often, hungry often, many miles away from home always, and a saddle for a pillow, a slicker for a bed, and a horse for a friend. It was evening when Curtis came into sight. I heard the horse's feet on the rocks of the mountainside. Then I saw men come into sight. Curtis was tired and haggard looking. He was bent forward in the saddle, but he seemed glad I was still alive. The doctor went to work patching me up. After he examined the wound and called the sheriff, and I told him I had been shot with a steel bullet like some man named Grimes, he told me I was better hope than I got Balders. Curtis had already left the men and told how I refused to shoot the Mexicans in the back while they slept, and the kindly doctor was from Carrizozo. When Kelly came to the Mexican, had told him all he knew to tell. Kelly took the Mexican's burro and went after White. Then he went to Sumner and got a deputy. They went up the river and found where we had crossed. They followed, thinking they would get there in time to bury us, while White and Kelly joked Curtis about forgetting to cock his Winchester. They told him he had better get a double-action gun before he chased any more thieves. He told them he would just take me along. When the sheriff and doctor went to find the dead Mexicans, they told us we had killed Balders. He had been one of the men I shot, though at the time I didn't know it. Fatty White asked my name. He also wanted to know if I was the same boy who had brought the LFD man to Portales. He told the others about Logan. Finally, they all ate supper and went to sleep. My wound hurt, and I didn't get much rest that night. I was spitting blood. I could tell by the way they nursed me that they didn't expect me to live. After they dug graves the next morning, White said, "Well, Cochran, are you next? Where do you want yours?" "I would like to die first, if you men don't mind," I said, and grinned at them. "Well, we don't have much time. The doctor says you can't travel. Thought we would bury you now, just so we wouldn't have to come back over here and get one just for one cowboy." Fatty White joked. I tried to smile, but the effort was too much. They decided I would go to Widow Clark's ranch since I couldn't travel far, and they needed to get back. I asked Mr. Keller to take old Dynamite home and pay Mr. Coger for the use of him. I told him I would pay him later. They rounded up the horses, and I was surely glad to see my 2 in the bunch. The deputy rode off by himself, leaving the doctor and the sheriff to take me to Mrs. Clark's home that evening. Mrs. Clark received us courteously. She was a middle-aged woman who had lived in the West all her life, and had come to that country as a young bride from San Antonio, Texas, to settle in White Mountains. She had 2 boys, aged 10 and 12. Her husband had been dead about 11 months. She and the boys had held down the ranch and were lonely for company. During my stay there, the doctor visited the ranch several times. My right lung was healing slowly.